Hey, thanks for joining us on our YouTube page. About to continue our series with my good friend Evan Graham, our contrast series. This is part 6. Really excited. Don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know how this message impacts you in the comments. Now, without further ado, let's see what Evan has to say.
Robert Downey Jr. is one of the highest paid and most popular and successful actors in all of Hollywood. His most popular role is that of, you can say it with me, Iron Man. Well done. In his role as Iron Man, he played for well over a decade, and his acting as Iron Man basically landed him as the face of the Marvel franchise cinematic universe for almost a decade. But looking at Robert Downey Jr.'s success today, you may not immediately be aware of all of the failures that littered his past. In 1996, just a few days after his very first Academy Award nomination, Robert Downey Jr. was arrested for the possession of heroin, cocaine, and an unloaded .357 Magnum handgun while he was racing down Sunset Boulevard. But it actually gets even worse than that. His failures didn't stop there. While still on parole for that instance, Robert Downey Jr. one night found himself under the use of a controlled substance, and while in a not-so-sober mindset, ended up wandering into his neighbor's house in the middle of the night. And after stumbling around his neighbor's house under the influence of this substance, he ended up crashing and falling asleep on his neighbor's guest bed. His neighbor woke up the next morning, walked downstairs into their guest room, and you can imagine how that went for him. Can you imagine if that was you waking up one day, you walk downstairs in your guest room, and there is Iron Man sleeping on your guest bed? Well, it wasn't a very funny moment for his neighbor or for Robert Downey Jr. That moment, his neighbor ended up calling the police on him, and Downey was arrested. He was tried in court, and at the bang of a judge's gavel, this stint landed him with a prison sentence for 3 years, a convicted criminal. And in Hollywood, when something like that happens to someone, when something like this comes to light, trespassing, addiction, a criminal conviction, normally that is the end of somebody's public career. But Downey Jr., he responded to this failure in a different way. He confessed. He admitted that he couldn't solve all of these problems that he had through willpower or through sheer self-reliance. And instead of going to prison, he decided that he would willingly be admitted to rehab. And that became the apex moment, where he admitted his addiction and that he needed someone's help from outside himself. That ended up being the first domino to fall that led to his life being turned around for good. And it would end with him making an acting comeback, getting married, finding himself playing Iron Man, and finding wicked success in the Marvel franchise. And it would end up with him having kids and a family to love and to care for, and that also loves and cares for him. When failure comes, your response matters. Well, my name is Evan Graham, and I'm the campus pastor at our Waldo location. And you're tuning in for week 6 of a series we are in right now called Contrast. It's all over the life of David from the Old Testament. And if you've missed any of these weeks or you want fuller context about where we are today, you can see all of our previous messages on our YouTube page or on RestoreCC.org. But here's the gist, the main idea of this series. Every follower of Jesus is called to live a life of contrast to the world around us because normal isn't working. You see, it's normal in the world we live in contrast to what Robert Downey Jr. did, to never willingly acknowledge our failures. It's normal to not acknowledge our failures. We see others refuse to acknowledge their failures in countless ways. Politicians, I think, are the best at this. They've mastered the art of what people call spin, where they can use the power of rhetoric and persuasion to convince the general public that a negative event they usually caused is actually a positive one. Celebrities are great at not admitting wrongdoing. And even pastors we see, sometimes wade through the waters of failure by using spiritual vocabulary to say the goodness of all of their successes far outweighs any failures that they have had. And really, as our nation as a whole continues to have a hard time admitting its failures and the scars of racism, and how racism continues to impact people, and specifically people of color, to this day. And all of that water that we swim in, it gets into us and impacts how we live. We begin to live a life where we ever avoid admitting to our mistakes and our failures. We cover them up, we pin them on someone else, or just flat out deny that they are real. But how's that working out for us? How's that working out for you? Probably not too well. See, because that way of living is not leading to the life we crave. It's destroying relationships, it's making community impossible, it's inhibiting our growth, and it's keeping us locked in shame and guilt, hindering us from ever experiencing forgiveness and compassion and love that comes through admitting that we have done wrong and receiving the gift of forgiveness. Normal isn't working. And so instead, we are invited to live contrast to what's normal, a life in the story of God rather than in the story of our culture. And what we see from the story of God told specifically in the life of David is this: when failure comes, your response matters. And now up until this point in our journey in David's life, we've really primarily only looked at his admirable traits. However, David is far from perfect. And today we're going to look at an episode in David's life, a notorious episode in David's life, where one failure creates this domino effect, which ultimately costs several lives. If you've got a Bible, you can open it up with me to 2 Samuel chapter 11. That's where we'll be at today. And picking up in verse 1, here's what we read. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. And so last week we told the story of David interacting with Mephibosheth, and this is taking place just a short time after that. Right before this, David went to war with these people known as the Ammonites, and this is happening just momentarily after that. But while David's army is still fighting the Ammonites and besieging the city known as Rabbah, we read that David did not go into the action with his army like kings are accustomed to doing. Instead, David stayed behind, and he initiates other action. And those 4 words, David remained in Jerusalem. It changes the subject of the narrative. All of the terror of war and battle, in the confusion of war and the confusion of battle, it's bracketed out, and it makes way for another kind of terror, another kind of confusion. There's a powerful silence in Jerusalem with this king at home, who now seems so settled and sure that his mind and body can wander from military action. Continuing on, here's what we read in verse 2. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman washing. The woman was very beautiful. Now, we don't know who this woman is. This is just a stranger that David sees across the way, and so he inquires to see who she is. In verse 3, we read this. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." There's her name, Bathsheba. But it's dangerously hyphenated. Bathsheba has no existence of her own, but she's only identified by the relationship she has to these various men whom she belongs. And now David knows who she is, but not only who she is, whose she is. She's a married woman, and she's trying to keep this king at bay. But guess what? David doesn't care. Here's what we read in verse 4. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Then she went back home. And so the action, it's really quick. The verbs by this narrator are actually intentionally rushed as the passion of David is rushed. It says, he sent, he took, he lay, she left. one verb after another. The verbs are rushed here, and the narrator is skillfully drawing us into an understanding of what is happening with this quick succession of verbs. This is David enacting an impersonal exercise of power. Walter Brueggemann comments on this narrative technique, and he writes this: "There's nothing in this narrative but action. There's no conversation. There's no hint of caring, of affection, of love, only lust. David does not even call her by name, does not even speak to her." And we see this plainly in verse 5 when at the end of this encounter, at the end of this quick succession of verbs, she's referenced just as this: the woman. David had just heard her name. This is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah. But here, after this encounter, she is only referred to as the woman. And this is a grave failure in this story. If the first failure, the first domino was David staying at home while the rest of his army fell, multiple dominoes begin to fall that leads us toward this. And the great failure is this: not only that David had an affair with Bathsheba, but that David didn't treat Bathsheba as a person, a human soul with a name and a story and a family, and instead he treated her as an object that he could use and then set aside. To David, this person wasn't Bathsheba, she was just the woman I can use for whatever I want because I am the king. And this reminds me of all the tragic stories of men in positions of power taking advantage of women in our day. Treating women with stories and names and dignity, made in the image of God, as objects. And if anything, this story should tell us that God is against that. And he will not let men in power who use women have the last word. God will not let David off the hook that easily. The verse continues on. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Now she is not just a woman that David can dispose of. She's bearing his child. And the whole kingdom will know that he slept with another man's wife because of it. But once David receives word that this woman is pregnant, he decides that he's not going to stand by and just let this happen. Instead, he acts, and he acts with the same quickness and decisiveness that we have seen him act in this narrative so far. His first plan is to try and cover it up. Let me just summarize for you what happens. David sends for Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, and he gets him out of the military and he gives him a month's leave from the action. And he expects Uriah to immediately go to his wife and to the marital bed so that he will think that he is responsible for the pregnancy, not somebody else. But Uriah is a loyal soldier, and he doesn't feel good about enjoying his wife while his fellow soldiers are all out at war, roughing it in the thick of battle and warfare. And so when this doesn't work, David then tries to manipulate him. He invites Uriah over to his palace for dinner. And he fills him up with food, but more importantly, he fills him up with drinks. And Uriah gets drunk. And he thinks that with Uriah's inhibitions immobilized, surely he will sleep with his wife. But even under the influence of alcohol, Uriah's integrity stands the test. He refuses in his drunken state to sleep with his wife while his fellow soldiers are at war, and so he sleeps instead on the steps of David's palace. David's plans fall short, and he's left with very few options to turn to. And so the narrative portrays Uriah quite in contrast to David as a principled man. Uriah will not sleep with his wife while the war continues, and how different David, who sleeps with the wife of another man while that man is risking his life for David and for a war that is David's. Uriah's words and his actions, they indict David. And get this, Uriah is not even an Israelite. Uriah, the Hittite, a foreigner, is the faithful one. Not the Israelite, not the king of the people of God, the foreigner. It is a stunning moment of disclosure. It's a stunning moment of contrast. And so David, running out of options, goes to his last resort. And no, it's not confessing to his mistake. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." Did you hear the tragedy of that? Do you hear that? Here is Uriah, marching back to war, proud that he has kept his integrity in check while home. He is eager to return to war to serve the king who he was just interacting with, who's treating him as a friend. He's giving him time off. He's feeding him, providing him with drink. He's eager to serve this king who has now become his friend. But all the while Uriah is marching there with all these thoughts and with all these feelings, in his hand he can feel the paper of his death note that David makes him carry to the war. Uriah is carrying in his hand the letter that is his own death warrant. The letter is a precise suggestion of how to get Uriah killed so that the pregnancy can be passed on to him without protest. And verse 16 says this, "So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died." And this word eventually gets back to David, and he exhales slowly with relief. His failure has been concealed. The guilt is past, but while David is exhaling in relief, Bathsheba is grieving her loss. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And after the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So verb by verb in this story, we watch David commit failure after failure. We watch domino after domino fall. His failures move from small to large. Have you ever been in a place like that? What are your failures? Have you ever had a failure that you committed morally? But instead of admitting to it, you did what was normal. And you buried it and you kept it a secret. Put all of your energy into covering up. Was it an addiction? Was it an affair? Was it a failure at work, a failure in your family? And do you now live in fear that you might be found out? Or have you ever committed a failure that you couldn't hide like David could? A failure that took everything away from you, a moral failure that damaged a relationship beyond repair, an occupational failure that you carry with you into every day of work, a failure in your family that caused a rupture with your kid or your sibling or a parent, a failure that wounded your self-esteem in a profound way to the point where now when your head hits the pillow at night, you are consumed with thoughts telling you that you will never amount to anything. A personal failure that contradicted all the values that you hold dear, that went against the grain of you becoming the person you wanted to be. See, we all face failure at some point in this life. And often these failures are conscious decisions. They're conscious decisions by us or by other people. But more often than not, I actually think our failures, these large failures we have, are accumulations of small failures. It's a domino effect. They go from small failures to large failures. And this is what we see in David. We see small failures happen one after the other, and end up as large failures. The story begins in verse 1 with the curt phrase, "David sent Joab to war and stayed behind." That's the first domino. It picks up steam when David is bored, lusts, and then sins to inquire about Bathsheba. Second domino. And then the plot thickens when David got and slept with Bathsheba despite knowing that she's married. The next domino falls when he sins for Uriah, manipulates him, and then when he sends word to Joab to put him on the front lines, and then finally, when David sins for Bathsheba again and marries her. Verb by verb, we watch David make these quick, rash decisions that magnify and that multiply his failures. They go from small to large. And the conspicuous absence of a verb in this story tells us something about the nature of failure, especially moral failure. David sins, he takes, he sleeps, and while all that is happening, what verb do we never hear in this story? He thinks. David thought. David considered. David was mindful of what he was about to do. David acts quickly and rashly, and we get the sense that here's the point, that it is always without consideration as to how his action's about to impact somebody else. David never stops for a moment and thinks about what he's doing. He just responds reactively and automatically over and over again, and it becomes this domino effect that takes his failures from small to large. See, when it comes to our failures, especially our moral failures, often they happen not out of intentional choice, but because of thoughtlessness, because we don't pause and consider how our actions will impact somebody else. And so we leave that mean comment online, or we say those harsh words, or we neglect that person or listen to that friend, not because we are evil, but because we don't take a moment to stop and think, to consider until it's too late, and our dominoes have fallen so much that now our mistakes have gone from small to large, and now we have to face what we have done. This is what happens to David. And God sees all of his failures, and he will make him realize what he's done. Chapter 11 ends with this line, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." And chapter 11 opens with, "The Lord sent Nathan to David." From here, I'll just summarize what happens next. The Lord sends this prophet Nathan to confront David over what he had done. He tells David a story that mimics his own. And when David realizes that, at the prompting of Nathan, David realizes his sins have been found out. And he's devastated when he faces the reality of what he's done. When he heard the same story told about someone else, he realizes the severity of his failures. And as a result of his sin, God revealed that this child that Bathsheba was pregnant with that was his would not survive. And David's mortified and he begs for mercy, but soon afterward his son passes away. David sinned in a severe way and he had to pay the consequences. But here's another contrast, though, in David's life that we can learn from. When failure comes, your response matters. And when David is confronted with this failure, he goes directly to God. And he prays day and night, asking for forgiveness. He doesn't grow bitter at God for confronting him. He doesn't grow bitter at Nathan or Bathsheba. He doesn't avoid confessing by attempting to justify his actions and explain, well, here's why I did what I did. That so often is how people confess to their failures. Here, I know what I did was wrong, but here's why I did it, just so you know. That's a way of avoiding confession. But David doesn't do that. He doesn't try and justify it. He's just honest. He just confesses to what he does, accepts the consequences, and then asks for forgiveness. Listen to the words of David in Psalm 51, which he wrote after these events. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me." When failure comes, your response matters. And David's response here can teach us first what to do, to admit our mistakes when confronted, to not try and justify our actions, but instead just admit what we did and go to God honestly to receive forgiveness. But we can also learn in this story by what David failed to do. And that is confess early and confess often. Confess when that first small domino falls rather than when that last large one falls. David didn't do that, and we can learn from what he didn't do. And that's the invitation. When you face failure, your response matters. And when you fail, you're invited to respond by confessing early and confessing often. First, confessing early. By doing this, you might stop the dominoes from falling. You might stop the train of failures from becoming too big. Confess early when you make those small mistakes by failing to stop and consider and think, for not filling up the gas tank when your spouse asked you to, for working too late again, or checking your email on that date night, or not paying that bill because you forgot, for being on your phone when your kids are trying to tell you a story, for exaggerating that one instance to your boss, for hurting your friend's feeling through that mean comment online or in person. Confess those small mistakes to others and to God, so that God's grace may abound all the more to you. And when you make those big mistakes, when you face a big failure, confess early. See, it takes way more energy to try and hide the mistakes you make than it does to just admit to them when they first happen. It's a lot harder, and it takes courage and vulnerability to confess it in that moment. I know it's hard. But the amount of energy does not even compare to the amount of forgiveness you will receive back from God and maybe even someone else. And so confess that you relapsed. Confess that you went back on your promise. Confess that you have not been the person you're acting like you are. And you might receive forgiveness, surely from God and possibly from someone else. So confess early. And when you do this, you will actually start to confess often. Confess often. See, as you practice confessing early, you will be changed. Pride will loosen its grip on you. You will become more humble, and you'll actually start to crave the freedom that comes with confession. And so you'll begin to just confess more often. It'll just become more natural to you. You'll find yourself saying you're sorry to your kids, to your roommate, to your friends, your coworkers, your family, your spouse, quickly after you make a mistake, whenever you make one. And as you confess often, you will likely then receive forgiveness, compassion, and love often. You see, the church is called to be a confessing community, a community that is humble, that willingly and joyfully confesses to one another when we make mistakes, holding on to the promise from the book of James that whoever confesses their sins finds healing. And in doing so, we live a life contrast to that of culture, where it's normal to never admit a mistake and thus never find healing. May we be a confessing community. Let me pray for you. Father, thank you for your forgiveness. May we rest in it. Would your forgiveness wash over us? Father, give us the courage to confess. Help us to be sure that we are sons and daughters of you and that can never be taken away from us. Give us the courage to say the thing that we know we need to, but that we're afraid to say to that person we have hurt, that we may be healed, that we may experience love and compassion and forgiveness from the place that we crave it most. To Christ I pray, amen.